On today's Faith versus Culture, we're talking about the World Watch List, Christian persecution, and how we can pray here in the West for our brothers and sisters in Christ around the world. All of that and more is coming up.
To have sex before you marry is a bad idea.
Don't tell me there's no such thing as gun violence.
That just depends on your definition of when life begins.
There are problems of sin and habit that cannot be solved outside the person of our Lord Jesus Christ.
Welcome to Faith versus Culture here on the CBN News Channel. I'm Goins-Phillips, joined by our CBN News managing editor, Dan Andros. Dan, how are you today?
Doing great, Trey.
Well, it's great to have our guest with us today, Ryan Brown. He's the CEO of Open Doors US. Ryan, how are you?
Doing good. Thank you.
Well, we're glad to have you here with us today. We're just a couple weeks into the new year, and each year Open Doors US releases its World Watch List, and the 2025 version of that list just came out a couple days ago. Talk to us about some shifts that you're noticing from 2024 to 2025. Give us the highlights of the top places around the world where persecution is happening for believers, and maybe some changes that you've noticed in the year past.
Yeah. So I think, the significant top line takeaway is that persecution and discrimination against those that profess the faith in Jesus Christ has continued to grow globally. You can see evidence of that in just that top line number. Last year, we were reporting that there were about 365 million Christians that experienced high levels of persecution and discrimination. That number increased this year up to 380 million. So certainly you see that the prevalence of discrimination continuing to grow around the globe. But I think also one of the things that's very telling this year is actually when you look at a country that actually fell off of the list. Malaysia was a country that I think they were at number 49 last year. And they are no longer on the list this year. And the reason they are no longer on the list is not necessarily because their score had improved. As a matter of fact, their score actually raised, but there were so many other countries that saw their situations worsen at an even greater extreme. And so in essence, they were overtaken. So the things that, were severe enough to have a country on the list last year were not enough to see them in the top 50 this year. So, that's another way in which we're seeing that, the persecution is really been widespread throughout this year. And I think one of the trends that we also see, certainly this year, is that continuation in how violence is characterizing how persecution is carried out and how persecution is experienced. We certainly see that across sub-Saharan Africa, but even in a country like North Korea, a country that has been at the top of the list for the majority of the years that the list has been in existence. And many would have argued that they were really kind of pegged they were kind of as high as they could go as far as their score. Even there, we see increased levels of violence that have been characterized in the realities and the experiences of Christians there in North Korea.
Ryan, how do we just taking a little bit of a step back here when we talk about persecution, we have these lists and we look at what's going on around the world. How do you actually characterize and define persecution? What are the sorts of things that qualify, just so we can kind of put a little bit of we obviously understand violence and those things would count as persecution, but what are the criteria here?
Yeah, that's a great question, because there is not necessarily a universally accepted common definition of this idea of persecution. And so, we will often refer to it in terms of persecution and discrimination. And we do that with intentionality to really kind of incorporate a couple of different ideas. When we are talking about this idea of persecution, discrimination, we're often talking about what we call the smash and is versus the squeeze of persecution. And so this smash of persecution is that idea. I think it's the thing that many of us intuitively, just kind of gravitate towards when we think of this idea of persecution. It is the, martyrdom. It is the assault. It is, church buildings being destroyed and those types of things. It's that smash of persecution. But we also recognize there's a great reality, and this is of an incredible significance for the church globally, this idea of the squeeze of persecution. And this is the idea that, Christians in certain areas, when they are living in conditions that makes it difficult to survive, and that can look in the form that, children are denied access to education, to schooling like other children are. Individuals are denied access to employment and not able to make a living. Why this is significant for the church is because when you have these situations where, a family is not able to survive and is forced to leave, that ends up gutting the church in those areas. When you have leaders that, members and, men and women in the church that are no longer able to sustain a physical presence in there because they can't support their family, they can't, feed their family, and they have to leave. That squeeze or persecution has dire consequences for the church in these areas as it guts the church of leadership and presence in a community.
Have there been any surprises that you've noticed in the years that Open Doors has been tracking persecution? Is there something that even in the 2025 updated list, that obviously you knew persecution was happening there because this is something that you spend a great deal of time obviously researching and studying, but are there trends that are either really alarming in ways that you weren't expecting, or just kind of surprising? This is an area where persecution is happening that I was not expecting it to continue to ramp up.
Yeah, that's a great question, because in many cases, and this is the benefits of looking at multiple years and looking at trends and things like that. There are some of these things that are significant, but it's kind of a slow roll that you can see it coming, and it continues to come. I look at the violence in sub-Saharan Africa that has continued to grow and to mount, and while that is reaching alarming levels, it's a trend that has been a continuation. I do think there are elements that, even with the recognition that this has been a multi-year trend, I think for many of us, the severity at which, that trend has reached has been somewhat surprising. We released a report as part of our cadence of research not long ago that was showing that, there are right now on the continent of Africa, 16.2 million Christians that have been displaced from their homes and are living, in essence, as internally displaced people or refugees, in some cases where they've actually had to flee their country. That's an astronomical number of folks that have, in many cases, these are individuals that, that their families have lived on these lands for generations, have farmed or, raised livestock and those types of things. And they're now being forced from these lands, these ancestral lands, and their Christian faith is a core component of why that is. That's not any other place, any other circumstances where you have 16.2 million people that have been displaced. That tends to make headlines, but this is a story that not many people have been made aware of. So there are certainly surprising elements there as well. I think that there are some other things that, I have been, I guess you could say, surprised, have been, it's been a difficult realization when even you take a look at a place like China. That's a name that often comes up in the context of persecution, but it is one that, for so many years, I think that the people have looked at these house churches, these underground churches, these unregistered churches, and just it's been no secret just the explosion that has happened with those churches and the growth that the Christian church has seen from these unregistered house churches. And some of those house churches have become quite large, and would rival and in some cases even dwarf the sizes of many churches here in the U.S. They've grown in such degree. But this last year, we saw a tremendous movement by the communist government there in China to close down these unregistered churches. There were over 10,000 churches that were effectively closed down this last year. Even within the registered churches, you saw a consolidation of those churches in which the government was forcing them to come together with this idea that, when it was more centrally located, it was easier to monitor and to control. And so, while the church in China, is one that, for many years in the midst of persecution, there's been so much to celebrate. This last year, that there were a lot of difficulties for Christians as those house churches came under fire.
Yeah, for sure. I want to note too here for anybody who wants to know more about the 2025 World Watch List from Open Doors US, or they want to see some of our reporting on this issue, you can go to faithwire.com or cbnnews.com, and we have a full write-up and actually another interview with Ryan where we talk about some of this in detail. So that's available for you. But we're going to fit in a quick break right now, and we'll be right back with more Faith versus Culture and Ryan on the other side of the break. Welcome back to Faith versus Culture here on the CBN News Channel. We're joined by Ryan Brown. Ryan, we've talked a lot there in the first segment about some of the updates, some of the changes to the World Watch List, what it looks like for believers facing persecution in countries around the world in different regions where it's much, much more violent and dangerous to hold to a Christian faith than it obviously is here in the Western world and specifically in the United States. I want to ask you specifically about Nigeria. That's been a country that has been on the radar now for several years, but it's one that the Biden administration really refused to put on any sort of watch list, despite even some of our own intelligence suggesting here in the United States that Nigeria is facing a lot of persecution. Obviously, World Watch List, it's number 7 on the 2025 list. So you're well aware of Nigeria facing persecution. Why is it, do you think, that there's been that hesitation? And why is it important more broadly for the United States to play a strong role in advocating for believers facing persecution?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, for those not entirely familiar with the realities in Nigeria, I often will look at Nigeria as kind of a snapshot or a representation of a trend that we're seeing throughout sub-Saharan Africa. And again, that is that characterization of how violence is just perpetuating and rippling throughout the manifestations of persecution in these areas. As a matter of fact, more Christians were killed because of their faith in Nigeria last year than any other country on the globe. The violence has been severe. And what we see in a country like Nigeria, they're not a singular factor. Persecution never exists in a vacuum. And so if you go to different parts of the country, there are really different types of drivers for the persecution that is occurring there. In parts of the state, you'll see Boko Haram as being a primary instigator. In other areas, there are Fulani militants that are the aggressors there. And in many cases, there's this desire to create instability within these areas. In certain areas, Christians are specifically being targeted because of their faith. In other areas, Christians are being targeted, but they're being targeted because as kind of a minority representation in those areas, they can really be targeted with impunity. Nobody is standing up for the rights of Christians in these areas. No local rule of law is stepping in to intervene. And so, for those actors that are looking to create, instability within these fragile state contexts, Christians can be an obvious target for them because it can perpetuate the violence and the instability within a region with very little repercussions or accountability for them. And so, in terms of your question, as far as this idea of the posture of the United States, I can't speak for any administration as far as, why they've made the specific decisions that they have. I can certainly, make the declaration and the call out that, as we look at these issues of foreign policy, we have to keep this idea of freedom of religious belief a core component in the considerations as that foreign policy is being established. Taking a look specifically in Nigeria, where you see this instability and recognize that religious persecution is being utilized as a tool to create that instability. If we are looking at foreign policy that is trying to create security, that's trying to create stability in these fragile state contexts, we have to address this idea of freedom of religious belief within our approaches and within the discussions.
Ryan, a couple questions for you here that are connected here. One, have you been able to meet throughout your time there with believers around the world, or at least talk to them or communicate with them through other people that are out in the field for you? And if so, what do you hear from these believers on the ground there that are being persecuted? What are the types of things they ask for?
Yeah, that is such a great question. Yes, I have had opportunity, and I would say, the most common refrain is this idea. I think for so many of us here in the West, there can be an assumption that when we talk about this idea of persecution, that the goal is to end persecution, that the goal is to, those that are suffering persecution, the goal is to pull them out of persecution. But as we talk with these individuals that are experiencing persecution, that's not what they're asking us for. They are seeing that they are being given and asked to step into an opportunity where they can be the light of Christ in a very dark circumstances. And so the thing that they are most common asking for is that we would lift them up in prayer, and specifically that we would lift them up in prayer, that they would not falter or fail in their testimony, that they would continue to let the light and the witness of Christ shine bright in these circumstances. And I don't know about you, but I find that so humbling. We live in a culture and a context where, I even look at my prayer life and, how much of that is slanted towards, requests and considerations for my own comfort or security or things along those lines. And to recognize, like so many of the apostles in the New Testament, that, that the cross of Christ is something we are called to carry. And even to the point that we can resonate with the words of the Apostle Paul, as he says, to die is to gain, that, we recognize that the security and the comfort of this lifetime is not the chief end, is not that the chief end of man, that's not our ultimate goal, but our ultimate goal is the glorification and the relationship with our Heavenly Father. In the scope of eternity, this time on earth, it's but a blip. And, that's why so many of these brothers and sisters in the midst of persecution can, again, resonate with the words of Paul as he says that these things in the scope of eternity, they're going to be seen as light and momentary afflictions. That I think there's so much that we have to learn and so much that we have to gain by engaging with our brothers and sisters. And I think, that the best way that we can do that is to lock arms in prayer with them. That's what they're asking for. And I think that as we lift them up in prayer, Christ uses that to start to shape our hearts and our understanding and our awareness as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think that's a great place to wrap the conversation. It's convicting, but also really encouraging what you're saying there, Ryan, about what the believers who are facing persecution around the world are dealing with. And look, if part of the body is hurting, the whole body is hurting, right? So it's important that we're aware of this and prayerful for it, and locking arms in prayer and in other ways with our brothers and sisters around the world facing such violent persecution. So thank you so much for helping us shine a light on that. We appreciate you being here, Ryan.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate it. Consider it a privilege to be with you today.
All right, everybody, stick with us. We'll be right back with more Faith versus Culture. Welcome back to Faith versus Culture. I'm here now with Dan Andros. Dan, I think right now I'm going through the Bible recaps. I'm reading through the story of Job and all of the absolute despair and horrific circumstances that he was faced with. And yet he was still faithful to God. Even in his conversations back and forth with his so-called friends, he was still, there were times when he was angry, but he still trusted in the faithfulness of God. And then what Ryan was talking about with Paul, and the persecution that the disciples faced is just convicting. And then to hear these stories that are happening right now in countries around the world of believers who are facing persecution, and rather than asking for it to end, they're asking for prayer that they could endure it and that the gospel would flourish despite all of the violence that they're facing. All of those stories are really encouraging and also really convicting, I think, to us here in the West.
Yeah, and it's really, truly remarkable when you, as Ryan mentioned, the people he's talked to. I've had the same experience a few times in the Middle East, talking to people, Christians who've been persecuted there. And it really is remarkable. It's the same pattern you see. Like, they're in the middle of this horrible situation and they ask for prayer, right? They're clinging to their faith in that situation. And it's almost like the situation's so bad, it forces you to reckon with your mortality and just the situation that you're in. And it a lot of times just forces people right before the throne. They have to take that to God and trust in God ultimately. And to see that and to hear that in the midst of that situation is very humbling, and it should cause us to pray for these people, because that's what they're asking. They're not saying, oh, I need, this material need and this material need, which are good and will help. That the main thing they ask for is prayer. So we should absolutely be giving that to them.
Yeah, such a good conversation, and I'm glad that we could have Ryan on to break down what persecution looks like around the world, even in 2025. So everybody stick with us. We'll be right back to wrap up this episode. That's all the time we have for this week's episode of Faith versus Culture here on the CBN News Channel. Thank you so much for being here with us to talk about the all-important issue of Christian persecution and what our brothers and sisters around the globe are facing and how we can be praying here in the United States. If you want more news from a Christian perspective, head on over to cbnnews.com. You can get all of that information there on the World Watch List and other news happening. Again, thank you so much for being here, and God bless you.